I have something important to show you.
What is it?
In the high, lonesome country, where the pines grew thick and the wind carried secrets older than any map, a solitary mountain man named Gideon Hope received a letter that would crack his world wide open. The letter came from a dying army buddy who begged Gideon to take his only daughter as a wife, a shy virgin girl named Lillian who had no one else and needed the protection of a good man. Gideon read the words twice, his thumb rubbing the faded ink, and then he sat in silence for an hour before saddling his horse and riding down to the stagecoach stop with a heart full of duty and empty of any expectation. Lillian stepped off that dusty stage wearing a simple gray dress, clutching a small carpet bag, her eyes downcast and her cheeks pale, looking as fragile as a sparrow in a hailstorm. Before you discover why this giant froze solid at the touch of her hand, tap that subscribe button and ring the bell so West Old Stories Official can keep bringing you frontier love stories that feel like home. Gideon saw the tremor in her shoulders and the way she flinched at the crack of the driver's whip, and something ancient and protective stirred in the cavern of his chest despite his intention to remain a silent guardian. He spoke no more than a dozen words on the long ride up the mountain, and Lillian answered with barely whispered syllables, her voice sounding like a rustle of dry leaves in October. That evening in the cramped cabin, she stood in the corner as if trying to disappear. So Gideon simply pointed to the bed and told her it was hers while he would sleep in the barn with the horses. Lillian's eyes widened with something unreadable, and for the first time she looked directly at his face. Not at the giant, fearsome frame, but at the tired, sorrowful man behind the beard. He was turning to leave when she moved across the room with the suddenness of a fawn finding its legs and gently, so gently, took his massive, rough hand into both of hers. Her small fingers laced through his calloused palm, and she held on with the steadiness of someone who had known the map of those scars for a lifetime, and Gideon froze as if lightning had split the floorboards beneath him. She did not flinch at the horny ridges of labor or the missing tip of his pinky lost to a bear trap. Instead, she traced the lines of his hand like she was reading a sacred text she had memorized long ago. Gideon could not speak, could not breathe, because no living soul had ever touched him with such intimate recognition, and the sensation broke over him like a warm summer rain on parched earth. Lillian looked up and whispered that she had heard about his hands since she was a little girl, how they had built this cabin alone, how they had carried her wounded father through the mud of Shiloh while cannon fire shredded the sky. She told him that her father had described every scar and every kindness those hands had ever performed, and she had dreamed of holding them herself ever since she was old enough to understand what a good man truly was. The mountain man's eyes stung, and he felt something that had been frozen inside his chest crack open, releasing a flood of warmth he'd been too proud to admit he needed. Instead of pulling away, he slowly closed his fingers around hers, enveloping her delicate hands with a tenderness that seemed impossible for a man who could snap a pine plank with his bare grip. Lillian's cheeks bloomed with color, and she told him she was not afraid anymore, because she felt as though she had already been walking toward this cabin her whole life, guided by her father's stories like a lantern in the dark. They sat by the fire that night, her hand still resting in his, and she confessed the full truth. Her father had passed 3 weeks ago, and his last words were that Gideon Holt was the only man worthy of his cherished little girl. Gideon, who had not wept since burying his own mother, felt a tear carve a path through the dust on his cheek, and he gruffly promised he would spend the rest of his days making sure she never knew another moment of fear. In the weeks that followed, Lillian transformed the cabin with wildflowers and the smell of fresh bread, and the mountain man who rarely spoke began telling her stories of the high lonesome trails he had walked alone. She would listen with her chin propped on her fists, laughing at his dry humor and asking 100 questions, and the sound of her laughter became the medicine he didn't know his soul required. One night, under a full moon that turned the meadow to silver, Lillian took his hand again and told him she had not just married him out of duty, but because she had fallen in love with the giant who let her hold his hand like a treasure. Gideon, who had always believed himself too rough and too solitary for any woman to abide, looked at her with a fierce, trembling hope and said she had made his cabin into a cathedral simply by walking through the door. He carved her a wedding ring from a piece of antler and polished it with beeswax until it glowed, and when he placed it on her finger, he did so with the solemn reverence of a man laying a cornerstone. Lillian wore that ring every day, and whenever a neighbor or a trader asked about it, she would proudly say it was made by the finest hands in the territory, hands that had carried a hero and built a home from nothing. She planted a garden in the stubborn soil, and Gideon built a chicken coop and a sturdy fence to keep the mountain lions away, both of them laboring side by side in a comfortable, glowing silence. The old-timers in the nearest settlement whispered that the surly giant had been gentled by a slip of a girl, but they said it with admiration, because anyone could see the peace that now rested on Gideon's weathered face. Lillian, who had arrived so shy she could barely meet a stranger's eyes, blossomed into a woman of quiet confidence who could barter for coffee and sugar with the best of them and still make Gideon blush with a single look. One autumn afternoon, Lillian placed Gideon's hand on her belly and told him that another pair of small hands would soon join theirs, and the mountain man sat down hard on the porch step as if his knees had turned to water. He pressed his ear to her stomach and heard nothing but the rhythm of her own life. Yet he swore he could feel the future pulsing beneath his palm, and he whispered a vow of protection to the unborn child that made Lillian weep for joy. Their son was born in the deep of winter, and Gideon held the squalling, red-faced infant with hands that had once wrestled steers, now cradling this tiny, perfect weight as if it were the most precious cargo in the world. Lillian, exhausted and radiant, watched her husband sing a rumbling, off-key lullaby that sounded more like a bear's hum, and she knew she had been right to trust the vision her father had planted in her heart. They named the boy after her father, and as he grew, they taught him that true strength was not the power to break, but the power to hold, a lesson learned from the night a shy bride took a giant's hand. Gideon never again felt the crushing loneliness that had once driven him to the high peaks. His cabin now overflowed with the music of childish chatter and the scent of Lillian's wild rose soap. Every evening, after the stock was fed and the lamps were lit, Lillian would reach for his hand in the quiet darkness and simply hold it, and he never froze again. Instead, he would squeeze back 3 times, their secret code for I love you. The story of their union became a beloved legend among the ranchers and trappers, a testament that a marriage built on the delicate bridge of a remembered kindness could withstand any blizzard the mountains could throw. When the circuit preacher next visited, he remarked that the whole cabin smelled less like leather and pipe smoke and more like cinema and baby laughter, and Gideon grinned, a rare and dazzling sight. Lillian often said that the hand she held that first night had been waiting for her grasp since before she was born, and the mountain man believed her with a faith as solid as the granite beneath his homestead. They weathered a grasshopper plague, a drought that turned the creek to a silver thread, and a wildfire that licked at their fence line, but they faced every trial with their fingers interlaced and their hearts braided together. By the time silver streaked Gideon's wild hair and Lillian's hands had grown as familiar as his own, the couple had built a small empire of love that was worth more than any gold strike or cattle herd. Their son grew tall and kind, and he eventually brought home a shy bride of his own, a girl who trembled until Lillian took her hand and told her the story of a mountain man who froze and then melted forever. Gideon stood by the hearth and watched his wife pass the legend to the next generation, and he felt a profound, swelling gratitude that a dying soldier's letter had led to a life he had never dared imagine. In their final years, the old mountain man would sit on the porch with Lillian's hand resting in his, and he would tell anyone who passed that the touch of a good woman was the closest thing to a miracle the frontier ever produced. When the time came for Lillian to leave this earth, she did so with her hand in Gideon's, and her last smile was one of absolute recognition, as if she were greeting an old friend she had always known. Gideon lived another 3 seasons, and every night he would sit alone with his hand open on the arm of the chair, imagining the weight of her fingers, until he too slipped away with a peaceful sigh and a barely whispered, "I'm coming, Lily." They were buried together under the juniper, where they had first planted beans, and the wooden marker read, "Here lie hands that held each other through every storm, and a love that began with a single knowing touch." The cabin still stands, its logs weathered but sturdy, and travelers say that if you listen closely on a still night, you can hear the echo of a rumbling laugh and the faint rustle of a woman's skirts moving toward an open hand. Now, if this tale of a shy virgin bride, whose touch rewrote a mountain man's entire world, stirred something deep within you, drop a heartfelt like and share your own stories of recognition and healing in the comments below. Subscribe to West Old Stories Official and ring that bell for more frontier sagas that prove love often arrives in the quietest moments, dressed in a gray dress and holding a carpet bag, ready to change everything.